Happy Wednesday, everyone, and thank you all very much for coming to today's Portage webinar on the Introduction to FRDR Curation, also known as the second half of our FRDR launch party. My name is Jennifer Abel. I am the training coordinator for the Portage Network, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. Our webinar today will delve more deeply into the curation service provided by the Federated Research Data Repository, or FRDR. We'll define what we mean when we say curation, and we'll briefly discuss the value the curation process can add to new data deposits. We will consider more specifically what the FRDR curation process entails and what FRDR curators look for when they review new deposits, including descriptive metadata, documentation, licensing, and sensitive content. We'll also share a few tips for preparing your dataset for deposit in FRDR. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. You have been muted automatically when you entered the room. This webinar is being recorded and the chat may be archived for those who are unable to attend. We encourage you to use the latest version of Zoom so that you have access to all of the features, including security updates. Please use the chat feature if you're having technical difficulties or if you have additional resources to share. And please use the Q&A option to ask questions of the presenters. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Questions may be asked in English or in French. We do have a code of conduct that we follow for all of our webinars, which you can see on the screen in brief, and which the link for will be in the chat shortly. Carl and the Portage Network are committed to providing a welcoming, safe, and harassment-free environment for staff, membership, committees, and working groups, as well as for participants, speakers, and organizers of Carl meeting and events. We do not tolerate harassment of any kind. And now our presenters for today are the curation team from the Portage Network, including Erin Clary, who's our curation coordinator, Nicole DeMichelis, Yvette Rancourt, and Subhanya Sivajyothi, who are our curation officers. And I'm thrilled to present them all to you today. And Erin, the pixelated floor is yours.
Thank you, Jen. Just share my screen here. Oops. And can everyone see that? Oops. Okay, so thanks for joining us. I would like to take a moment also to acknowledge that I'm joining you as a visitor on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish people. And just to say that I'm very grateful to be here in this beautiful place. Oh no, I can't control this. There, sorry. Had to get control of the slides. So my name is Erin, and I'm joined today, as Jen said, by Nicole, Yvette, and Subhanya to speak with you about the curation services at the Federated Research Data Repository, also called FRDR for short. We're all going to deliver a part of the presentation today, so you can get to know our team a little. I'll start by giving just a little bit of background information on FRDR, and then we'll dive into curation specifically. So what it is, the value that it adds, what curation services at FRDR look like, because the curation services can vary from repository to repository. And we're also going to share a few tips that we hope will be helpful to you as you're preparing data for deposit, either in FRDR or elsewhere. Okay. Yep. So FRDR is both a discovery service for Canadian data and a general purpose data repository. It's open for faculty members or their designates from Canadian institutions or organizations that are eligible to receive tri-agency funds. Any of them can deposit data in FRDR. We accept data sets from any Canadian researcher in any discipline. And we're especially well suited for medium and large size data sets that can't be accommodated by, for instance, an institutional data repository or a disciplinary data repository. Under our current model, each researcher will receive an allocation of 1 terabyte of storage, and we can work with you to extend this if need be. We're happy to accept data in both raw or processed form, whatever will be most useful to your research team and the scientific community in the future. Your data can be associated with a research publication or not, and we welcome you to link out to other materials that will provide context to your data. Sorry, I guess one other point, just to say that you can deposit data at any time. So this can be data from a study that was completed 10 years ago, data from an ongoing project, or data from a project that has recently concluded. We're happy to ingest it all. There are just a few things we ask you to take into consideration before you deposit your data. And so first is that your data should be in a relatively stable state because we are publishing the data. And while we can update data sets or create a version if need be, this is intended for infrequent changes or to correct found errors. We can't currently accommodate dynamic data or data sets that will be highly changeable. Please also be aware that any data deposited in FRDR will eventually be publicly available. We can protect data from download temporarily with an embargo, but we don't have encrypted servers at this time, so we're not currently able to manage restricted access data. We do have technical work and policy considerations underway, but this work is still in the early phases. So in the interim, we do ask you to remove or mask any sensitive information that can't be shared. And please also review any data sharing agreement that you may have entered into to ensure that you can distribute the data and that it can be publicly available. If you have any questions about our service model, I just want to say that you're welcome to contact our support desk at any time. If you want to talk about what you're considering depositing, we're here to help you sort of walk through that. So please feel free to reach out. Okay, and so after you have finalized your submission, you'll receive an email to confirm that we have your deposit. You'll have your DOI at this time, but just a quick note that it won't be registered or active until your data set has been approved for publication. And once you've submitted, you'll no longer be able to edit your data set. If you submitted by mistake or realize that you need to add something, just reach out to us and we can return the data set so you'll have editing privileges again. And once we've received it, a member of our curation team will review your submission before your data set is published. And as I mentioned last week, we're not reviewing the scientific merit of the research or validating the data itself. We're not currently trying to reproduce study findings or anything like that, but we are here to help researchers improve discoverability and usability in the short term and hopefully make it so that your data set will be available for use in the long term. Our curation team draws on their knowledge of research data management best practices to enhance the fairness of new deposits. But what does that mean really? What is curation? What is it good for? What steps are we taking with each new deposit? For that, I'm going to turn things over to the rest of the team. So without further ado, I will pass things over to Nicole.
Thank you, Erin. So to speak more broadly about the field, what is data curation? Now, as a relatively new field with a somewhat amorphous definition, it is something that lends itself to comparison and metaphor quite a bit. I've heard us described as data janitors, as data magicians, which is a little more flattering, but slide. I like to think of it more like a data glow up. So The term curation can have connotations of evaluation and judgment, but that's not what we're here for. We're not here to judge data. We're here to give it a day at the spa so it can just be its best self. Slide. Now, the concept of curation and of the FAIR principles are intrinsically linked. A reminder that FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. These are a set of principles that are central to our work as curators, but they are principles, and such they operate on a continuum. It's not that data is fair or not fair. It's not a bar to clear. It's somewhere along that spectrum. So, for example, if your data is written in shorthand on a pile of Post-its stored underneath some sports memorabilia in your office, that's not going to be very findable, accessible, interoperable, or reusable. That said, even the most beautiful record with robust descriptions and standardized vocabularies and all the things that make librarians' hearts go pitter-patter, there will be always something to make it a little bit better. So we take it as somewhat of a professional challenge to always be able to offer some sort of helpful feedback, no matter how perfect a submission is when it reaches us. Slide. Okay, now just because the FAIR principles are principles, they still have concrete ways that they are operationalized. So without getting too detailed, when we talk about findable, a lot of that is related to the machine findability of this. So a lot of this we handle over at FRDR. Erin mentioned the persistent identifier and just indexing in a searchable resource. That's us. And rich metadata. Talking about accessibility, this is regarding making sure the user, that whatever the user needs to access the data is accessible as possible, ideally open and free. So even if the data itself isn't open, for example, in the case of sensitive data, the exact terms of its access should be clearly defined in order to work towards that goal. Interoperable. We can't really foresee now how future researchers might want to reuse the data. So we want to make it as machine friendly as possible so it can be migrated forward, so it can be combined with other data. So all of those goals around standardized metadata and formal, accessible, and shared language are key to interoperability. And lastly, we have reusable. So this kind of brings us a bit closer to the human side of the FAIR principles. What do we need in order to reproduce the data? Are the data usage rights clearly stated? Does the provenance detail any change that's happened over the data's life? Slide. It's always a bit of a balancing act and a harmonious collaboration between machine and human to make the data as discoverable and usable as possible. Machines are very good at discovering data that have rich metadata, controlled vocabularies, persistent identifiers, and are indexed in a searchable repository. Machines are good at using data that are in open formats and well-structured. An example would be tidy data, if you're familiar with that concept. On the flip side, humans have a bit different needs. As a human myself, I can testify that humans are good at discovering data that have robust descriptive metadata, including fields that might not be indexed. READMEs are essential. If we take nothing else away from this today, just know that we love READMEs. Humans are good at using data that have clearly defined variables, instructions, license terms, citations, and comments. Slide. Now, forgive my somewhat overly complex slide here, but I want to talk about curation throughout the research process. So as a sort of standard representation of research data management, or RDM, we have this cycle that goes through plan, create, process, analyze, disseminate, preserve, reuse. As curators working with a repository, we are often introduced to the research data at the dissemination phase. But that doesn't mean that that's where curation starts. Curation is about keeping that dissemination phase in mind right from the planning stages. It's a thread that weaves through the entire process. And that's why we are infinitely grateful for institutional librarians and data management plans who start that process much earlier before we ever get a chance to see the data. While we do tend to get our hands on the data at the dissemination phase, we're here to support this field more broadly. So feel free to reach out with questions earlier in the research lifecycle. Slide. So curation as part of research data management. All of the incredible values of RDM apply as well to curation. They ensure the dependability, accuracy, and validity of data. Managing data helps ensure enhance its replicability. It also promotes organization, saving headaches like lost data and endless hours of data scrubbing at the end of a project. It means the research will be more likely to be replicated and will offer a level of transparency to accompany any publication. Slide. But I might be somewhat biased towards curation, but just specifically how curation contributes to this. Curation reinforces all of that added value of research data management more broadly. It helps increase transparency. It renders research more likely to be reproducible and more likely to be properly cited. So we're talking about reinforcing the second half of the research data lifecycle, the sharing, preserving, reusing. And this is about connecting and collaborating science more broadly. So sharing data means more citations, more sharing, more knowledge. So in addition to making the researcher feel good with more citations, it helps increase the impact of the data and its use, which is amazing. It contributes to our value of human knowledge, but it also contributes value in terms of dollars and cents. Anyone who's been involved in research can say that data collection is often very expensive. So if we can share that data in a way that is reusable, we can save ourselves money as well as time. And now I'm going to hand it over to Yvette to talk a bit more about specifically what we're doing at FRDR.
Thanks, Nicole. Just let me know if you have any difficulties hearing me. I'll try to speak loudly. So I'm going to get into the specifics of what FRDR curators are looking for when we receive a new data set. Next slide, please. So after you submit your data set to FRDR, one of us will be assigned to work with you to make your data as fair as possible. So our workflow is based on the Data Curation Network's curated steps that you can see on the slide there. We'll actually eventually be using a slightly different acronym that works in English and French. So it'll be curation instead of curated, but the basic idea will stay the same. So even though we're using this acronym as a guide, the activities aren't always linear. And actually, they're often happening all at the same time with a lot of overlap, as you'll see when I kind of dig into the specifics a little bit. Next slide, please. So if you wanted to kind of do a deep dive on the curation activities and definitions, I encourage you to check out the definitions of data curation activities used by the Data Curation Network report from 2016 by Johnson et al. That's linked in the slide there. But today I'm going to talk more specifically about FRDR. So next slide, please. So as Erin mentioned earlier, we're not actually, peer reviewing your data or anything like that. We are looking at the structure and the organization of the data set specifically. So when we say check and understand, we mean files, documentation, and metadata. So we're going through and we're looking for typos, looking for missing information, and basically really trying to confirm that we have what you sent us. So with every new deposit, FRDR will generate a nice little file tree for us that'll show the file structure, the size of the files, file names, formats, and it will also do a malware and virus scan. So we'll kind of compare that information with your README, your description, and any other relevant metadata that you've provided us. Then we're going to kind of dig in a little bit, and we're going to be looking to see if everything can be opened or run as expected. Are there any corrupted files? That kind of thing. So for a smaller data set like the one in my slide example here, we'll be able to have a look at every single file in there. Oh, is this art as mysterious as it claims? We'll have a look and see what's in there. But of course, for larger data sets, that are multiple terabytes, right? That's just not realistic for us to look at every single thing. And in that case, we'll be doing a kind of sample check of, example of different file formats and things like that. We'll be looking at that. If you're given us tabular data, we'll be checking to see if it's well structured. So, things like variables in columns, observations in rows. Do you have a code book that explains what, your variables mean? If you've submitted us some code, we'll be checking things like, is the code well commented? Have you listed out any dependencies needed to run it? That sort of thing. And again, we'll also be keeping an eye out for licensing and copyright issues. So if you've indicated that you're using third-party code or that your data set may contain some kind of sensitive information, chances are pretty good that we'll be contacting you, to just get some additional information there. We're not copyright or privacy experts by any means. And again, like Erin mentioned, data depositors are ultimately responsible for adhering to FRDR's terms of use and making sure, they're not submitting anything that really shouldn't be publicly available. Next slide, please. So moving on to the next segment, request and augment. So this is where we're kind of reviewing metadata to check that it is as descriptive and complete as possible. So FRDR uses DataSite schema and Dublin core, and we also support the use of PIDs. So those are persistent identifiers. And you may have heard of some of them like ORCIDs. So those are persistent identifiers for researchers, or DOIs. And those are persistent identifiers for digital objects. So often, like a related publication or data set will have a DOI. FRDR also has the capability to have geographic metadata. So we can use that with Geodesy, which is FRDR's map search function, which allows users to browse data sets based on their location. So, we'll have a look at this, and curators will make some simple changes to the metadata. So things like punctuation, or maybe adding the full name of a university or a province, where it's really obvious, if you have the abbreviation. But really anything more substantial than that will be discussed with the depositor beforehand. So, maybe adding a keyword or updating the description, any changes to files, that's all something that, we will make sure we have your approval before anything goes ahead with that. And, we understand that depositors are, busy. It's not your full-time job to be depositing things into FRDR. So we'll give you kind of a curated list of recommendations, a top 10, a top 3 for how you can enhance fairness with your data set. And, we're trying to make things as painless as possible. So we'll kind of offer, templates. Sabanya will talk a little bit more about that in tips and tricks. But, we'll give you suggestions for keywords, descriptions like that. Again, just want to highlight that there are, nice to haves and need to haves. And if the nice to haves really aren't working for you, that's a conversation we're happy to have. We're not here to tell you what to do. We just want to support you as best as we can. And again, we can often make the majority of changes on our end, but in some cases, we will return the submission to the depositor to make changes themselves. And that's usually if it's related to the data itself or the file. Next slide, please. So one of the changes we might suggest is transforming proprietary file formats into open source formats where appropriate. So if you have a really good reason why you need to use that Word doc, awesome. But if not, we might say, hey, maybe you want to change it into a TXT. So we're curating with long-term preservation in mind, and formats becoming obsolete or inaccessible over time is just something to keep in mind. And, kind of like I mentioned, evaluating fairness is something that we are doing throughout the entire curation process. It's not just at the end, even though evaluate kind of comes towards the end of the acronym there. But, our recommendations to you will often come with explanations of why we think they're useful, of exactly how they are supporting fairness. So, findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. Next slide, please. So after all of that reviewing, making recommendations, we on our end are making sure that everything we do is well documented in a curation log. That's the second thing we'll do. We'll get a new deposit and we'll open a curation log right at the beginning. And that's so that we have a good record of our actions and that we can refer to in the future if needed. Then we will go ahead and we'll publish your data set on FRDR, and you'll get a shiny new DOI that will link to your data set. And, after everything's all published and you have your little at-home publication party, which may or may not involve pineapples wearing sunglasses, who knows, you can still contact us if you need to make any changes. So for example, one thing that we get a lot is if you published a paper using your data set and you want to link that publication in the dataset metadata, that would be a great time to contact us, and very easy for us to update on our end. So that kind of brings me through all the curated steps, all the different things that FRDR curators are doing. If you have any questions about those sort of things specifically, we'll answer them at the end of the talk. But right now, I'll hand things over to Sabanya.
Thank you, Yvette. Let me know if you're having trouble hearing me. So now that Yvette has gone through what curators look for, I'm just going to share some specific tips and tricks for best practices for submitting your data. A lot of what I'll discuss here is also covered in FRDR's online documentation in the Preparing Your Data section. Slide, please. So the first section is documentation. You want to provide as much context as possible. For quantitative data sets, you want to define all the variables, allowable values. You want to include a brief description for your study, the methods that you've used to collect your data, any steps that you took to process the data that you're depositing. You might already have an associated publication that describes your methodology and your data processing, but we do strongly suggest that you include any information necessary to correctly interpret the data in the data set as well. This will just help ensure that your data remains accessible and useful into the future. And it's also important just in case the article is behind a paywall or there's some sort of institutional access barrier. We also ask you to include a README file and encourage you to include any other documentation or supplementary information that you think is useful. This could include, Yvette mentioned earlier, a code book, study protocols, data analysis plans, anything like that. A README file is also intended to provide an overview of the data set. So this often includes project level metadata, such as contributors, funders, dates of collection, but it should also include file level metadata, such as descriptions, naming conventions that you've used, information necessary to interpret your files, etc. We do have a README template available to download in our documentation, once again, the Preparing Your Data section, and we can certainly help you prepare a README if needed, so feel free to email us about that. Once you've made the README, we recommend keeping it at the top level, just so it's easily accessible for someone looking at your data set. And we also encourage you to link any related resources, such as associated publications, code software, anything else that might be useful for you interpreting the data set. Next slide. So the next section is metadata. Similar to what I said about documentation, you want to provide as much context as possible. This is important because metadata is what's used to find, interpret, and use the data. We don't require very many fields, but we do recommend filling in as many recommended fields as possible to facilitate discovery and use. You want to use a descriptive title that will work well in the data citation. And you also want to include a description of the data set as a whole. You can think of this as an abstract for your data set. Keywords are important, and also location information if you have it available, such as geographic coordinates and bounding boxes. This will help your data set show up in map-based searches. Next slide, please. So the next section is file naming and file structure. The file names themselves should provide information about the content of the data file. You want to use descriptive file names, but also keep them short at the same time. You can abbreviate things like project names or site names, and then define that in your documentation that you've provided. Your naming convention should be described in your README file. Don't include any information that's potentially sensitive in the file names. This could include human participants or protected site location information. Directories shouldn't be overly nested. Make sure to remove all your junk files and intermediary files and anything you didn't want to share publicly, of course. And furthermore, you want to avoid using special characters or spaces within file names. So you can arrange these files by type, date, analysis to make them easier to understand. The image in the slide shows a structure where all the files are arranged by date. And you can put the need to know information in the directory name itself, but bear in mind that the files might be moved around at a later date. So you do want to put all the important information such as the file name. You want to put all the important information within the file name itself. So it still makes sense without the inherited folder structure. If you're storing multiple versions of a file in one directory, add a version number to the end of the file rather than using a descriptive word like final, which could definitely lose meaning if you continue to make further changes. And one last thing is that FRDR can accept open directory structures as well. So for file formats, just going the slide back, there's more about the file formats. For file formats specifically, we prefer open formats whenever possible, like Yvette indicated, but we can accept proprietary file types. We just can't guarantee their stability or interpretability over time. Some questions that you want to think about is this file format widely used in the field, or is it likely that other researchers will have access to the software necessary to open your files? And then you also want to question, if you do transform your files into an open format for deposit, will any information be lost? We're also willing to accept data in multiple formats if you want to keep data files both in a specialized format and the plain text format. Next slide. So now potential sensitivities. The first thing is data coming from a third-party source. The license that you can choose for your data might be limited if you if you use data from a third-party source. Definitely don't share anything that you don't have permission to redistribute, and for data or derived products that you can share, select the terms that respect those assigned to the original data source. For example, if your data includes a variable from a data set previously published under an open government license, you can redistribute those data points, but you must use an equivalent license such as CC BY, which requires attribution. You can also use a related identifier field to link out to the original data source, and you can provide full attribution to the source data in your README. The related identifier field can also be used to link to other published objects. For example, an associated research publication, a published protocol, code or scripts, anything like that. The CC BY license is a very popular choice for data because it allows the data to be free to use and repurpose as long as the attribution is provided. The next point is potentially sensitive location information. Anything related to vulnerable species, private land, protected sites, you'd want to remove the location or coarsen the geographic coordinates. And the last thing is data collected from human participants. If it involves human participants, we will ask for an unsigned copy of the participant consent form and any review language from any statements that might preclude sharing the data in FRDR. All that data has to be de-identified for public use since FRDR doesn't currently accept restricted access data. And yeah, that is our overview of the FRDR curation process. Thank you for joining us, and we definitely look forward to working with you. And we wanted to open the floor for questions now.
Thanks very much, everyone. That was a great whirlwind tour through the curation processes at FRDR. And we've got a lot of questions that have come up as a result of that, which is great. There are a number of questions we're seeing here about the relationship between FRDR and Dataverse in terms of, does FRDR harvest Dataverse? Do you have to choose between one or the other? Do they communicate? Could you talk a little bit about that relationship to start, and then we might be able to get into some of the more detailed questions about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. If you're having trouble deciding and you have a research data management librarian, they might be able to help you choose. We also have a document, I'm not sure, I can look for the link in just a moment, that sort of explains the differences and similarities between Dataverse and FRDR. But if you have deposited your data into a Dataverse, it'll still be, we'll still harvest the metadata and we'll still make it available in our sort of search layer. So anyone who comes and uses the discovery layer of FRDR will be able to find data sets. And I think we're indexing about 86 different repositories right now. But yeah, I mean, other than that, you know, FRDR really was purpose built for larger data sets. We can accept small data sets, so that's not a limitation. But just to say, if you have something that's a terabyte, it's probably going to, in that case, be better suited for FRDR rather than your institutional repository.
So just to confirm, you deposit in one or the other, not in both. And if you deposit in a Dataverse, the metadata can be harvested by FRDR.
Yeah, sorry.
No, just wanting to summarize.
Yeah, that's true. It's always best to just select one repository, and then, because you'll get a unique identifier, other people can cite it and find it. And we are harvesting metadata, like you said.
Okay, great. So the curation, go ahead.
I just want to address an adjacent question here. That does the curation process only occur when directly depositing into FRDR?
That's where I was going next.
Well, great minds. So as the curation officers, we interact directly with the data sets that are deposited to us. So us at FRDR only. That said, because they are indexed by the discovery layer, that's a bit of a separate thing from what we're doing here with the FRDR data sets. And if you talk to Kelly about the metadata, I'm sure that there's something that happens between the metadata of Dataverse and the FRDR discovery portal, but that is not what the curators are working on.
Great, thank you. And we've put a link in the chat, thanks Beth for that, for repository options in Canada. And from that you can get to the Dataverse versus FRDR question. And it's not Dataverse versus FRDR, they're complementary options, but they do different things. So those links are there for you in the chat now. Thanks for asking for those. What would you say is the average amount of time you spend with each data set submitted?
Does one of y'all want to take that question, or? It's really highly dependent on the size of the data, the type of the data, on how much work was done before the data was submitted. You know, if there's already really robust documentation and it's open source formats, you know, and something we've worked before, and it's a medium-sized data set, you know, it could just be a few hours. It's a really large data set or a new to us format of data. It can take, you know, it can take a day or two. And then there's also the sort of back and forth piece. So we'll make recommendations or requests of the depositor. And so depending on how quickly they're able to make those required changes or whether or not they want to make the requested changes, that can add a few more days onto the process. But, you know, we try to have everything done within 2 to 5 business days. And we are giving the DOI right away, so we don't want to hold up publication or anything like that. If you need your data set published on the fly because it's holding up production of your manuscript, you can contact us and we'll do everything we can to try and prioritize and push that through. So we're not a bottleneck.
So it varies from data set to data set is the.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I'd say on average, it's probably, you know, 2 days. Only the really big ones are going to take more than that. And now it's hard to say because there are 4 of us. For a while, we were a smaller team. We should be able to move more quickly now.
Great. We have a couple of questions in the chat about RORs or RORs. And we're very lucky today that we have Kelly Stathis, who is our metadata and discovery coordinator, who is open to answering these questions about RORs.
I think I can also speak to it if Kelly doesn't want to. I don't want to. If you want to, though.
I'm here and happy to speak to it. I do have a bit of construction noise happening, so I apologize for that in the background. Some drilling in my building. So with ROR, that's something we're working on implementing currently. So the process will be that similar to as it is now, you can start typing your author affiliation, and then there'll be some suggestions in the drop-down menu. And with the implementation we're planning, that will then also add the ROR identifier to the metadata in a separate field. So you won't have to go and look up the ROR and provide it yourself. It will just automatically happen in the background. And I saw there was also a couple of questions on so the funding agencies, CIHR and CERT and SSHRC. And for that, we're actually planning on using the Crossref funder registry for the funding identifiers. But if there were a researcher that were affiliated with one of those agencies, I believe they do also have RORs.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Erin, anything you wanted to add to that, or? Nope. Okay. Once you deposited something into FRDR, do you need to deposit a new version if changes are necessary?
So we don't have a formal versioning process in place yet. We are able to make changes to published data sets, but what those changes look like is going to depend a little on the size of your data set and what you need to change specifically. So if you've deposited 3 terabytes of data and all you need to do is add 2 small files, we're not going to create an exact copy of that original 3, you know, and essentially now make a 6 terabyte data set just to add 2 small files. So what we'll do is add those new files to the data set and then also create a version history document to sort of clearly explain what the original data set looked like, what was added, and why the change was made, so that it is transparent to any end user who may have, you know, visited the data set before. If it's a smaller data set, you know, we might try we have done a couple now where we've sort of duplicated the files and made 2 top level directories. So there's a version 1 and a version 2, and each contains a complete set of the files that were in that specific version. But yeah, but if that case happens, we're happy to work with you and come up with a solution that, you know, that you're comfortable with, but that also keeps things transparent for the end user. And it is on our radar. We're hoping to get a formal versioning process in place, but your DOI will remain the same. Everything will still be at the same place.
Great, thank you. And we had a follow-up on one of the version control questions. Where is data indexed?
If the data set is modified, we essentially will redo the file cache on the back end. And so that'll cause all of the new files to display as well. But the data sets that we index in FRDR, including our own data sets that are deposited into FRDR, are indexed according to the metadata that you're adding at sort of the top level. So the title, the keywords, and things like that, that's what's running the index. So your DOI won't change, and none of that will change unless you need to add terms or you want it to be indexed in a different way. I don't know if that answered the question quite right, but so let me know if I can follow up on that.
Okay, great, thank you. So a question here, often code can run but create incorrect results depending on the software and method being run. Without discipline-specific analysts, have you had cases where errors were missed or were even created by the review?
I can chime in there.
Great.
Because I do have an example. So we're not reviewing code as like a code review because I just don't have the expertise to know, and I don't have the background on the data. But we do run the code to ensure that it runs and it can open and run effectively. And if we spot anomalies, we'll let the researcher know. So we had an example where someone submitted some GIS data that was all local, except for one point that was in the middle of the ocean. So we just sent them a note being like, this point is in the middle of the ocean, is that intentional? If they say yes, then it's fine. It's not, we're not here to correct data. So we can act like a second set of eyes, but not as a code review.
Yeah, so I guess I would add to that for code review, what we're interested in is, is the code well commented? Are dependencies accounted for? If somebody who is familiar with this environment, like, is there a reasonable expectation that they could understand this and either transform it into the language that they prefer to use? Or can they run it themselves? And we will try to run it if we can. And if we get stopped up, we'll let the researcher know. And oftentimes it is just that there was, a dependent package that was sort of installed on the background in their machine and they didn't realize, and, I didn't have it, it wasn't going to work. And in terms, sorry, one more thing about code. We do encourage people to deposit, scripts that they use to process or analyze their data alongside the data set. But if you actually have model code or if you've developed software or something, we really do encourage you to think about using an environment that can take those frequent versions like GitHub or Bitbucket, and then you can actually really easily push your code into the Software Heritage Archive, and they'll give you a unique identifier, and we can then link from your FRDR data set to that code where it lives. And yeah, if you're in that situation, happy to give you more details or walk through that process with you. Just reach out to our support desk.
Great, thanks. So a question here about our very hopeful and bright future with FRDR. Considering the potential time requirements, how do you plan to scale up if and when, let's go with when, FRDR becomes more popular? We know this is a major challenge for other data repositories, so.
Yeah, and sorry, I think, I was answering the question before, like how long does it take to process or publish a data set? And I was really thinking of that more as like the full process. So that's not all active time, right? So if I'm working with a 2 terabyte data set, some of that time is going to be spent downloading files, but I can be doing other things while that's happening. So the active curation time where we're really, again, that depends on like how much documentation do we need to create, how much sort of research do we have to do to understand what we're seeing and using and working with. I don't know though, I want to say average curation time is probably more like 3 to 5 hours. Does that seem reasonable? We haven't been tracking our time, but maybe we should. I mean, because it is a good question. I think if the service becomes very popular, hopefully we will be able to bring on more curators, or start to, we've been talking about, is there a way that we can start to create this curation network in Canada where we're drawing on other people, research data management librarians, or disciplinary data managers or disciplinary experts who are interested in these sort of things to also help work on submissions. So.
I also just wanted to add up in like the 3 to 5 hours, I feel like it's diminishing too. The first time we encounter a data set from a field or in a certain software we don't know, it can take 10 hours. And then every time after that, it's less and less. So I'm hoping that as we start to scale up in quantity, so we will scale down in the amount of time we need to spend with each data set as we become more familiar.
Good point. That's a good point.
Yes, and we have some votes in the Q&A for definitely having a curation network being a very good idea. So
yeah, we agree. I think that there just needs to be a little bit of scaling up, getting people familiar with it and developing some shared resources that people can use, and then networking step 2 or 3. But
so this kind of builds into one of the comments we've got here in the question and answer. And I'll note that we're about 5 minutes to the hour, so we will be winding down the question session shortly. Kelly Kobe is noticing that compared to other places they can put their data, FRDR is very managed. Is it worth considering if or how some aspects of the curation can be the responsibility of the researcher?
yeah, I mean,
things like at the beginning of the process that you were mentioning with the surveys.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. And, I think that in the beginning, like Nicole said, things may take more time, but as researchers as well become more familiar with the deposit process, the first time we work with the depositor, we may have to provide like a README template and work with them on documentation and do things like that. But the hope is that the second time they come to deposit a data set, they've sort of already been through the process and know what we're looking for. At this point too, maybe they've been required to make a data management plan. So when researchers are thinking about these sorts of things from the start, they end up with a product that's much easier to share, and that makes the process really quick at our end. I think one other thing I would mention is that we are working with so research groups specifically that might have data managers. Those research groups can sort of have a collection in FRDR, and we can work with those research data managers specifically so that they're actually taking on a lot of the curation work for us, and the data sets we get are pretty much close to being good to go.
Okay, a quick question here. Is the dataset license the same as the publication license? Does it have to be the same as the publication license?
No, not at all. Not at all. They're two separate objects, so you can assign a different license to each. So even if your article was behind a paywall, but you wanted your data to be in the public domain, that's possible. And we just link between the two objects. The dataset license would only be dependent on, what you're comfortable with, or if you have some sort of data sharing arrangement with an industry partner, or if you're using data from a third-party source. Those sorts of things can affect the data license, but the publication doesn't matter.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we've got a comment here about it's unfortunate sensitive data at this point, sensitive data in FRDR, with the note that with the requirement coming up to deposit, researchers will be looking for options. So no, I recall hearing that there is some work going on with FRDR trying to get sensitive data as a possibility.
Yeah, and not sure if Victoria's here, and don't want to put her on the spot either, but it is a project that we're hoping to pilot soon. Some of the technical work has been done, and Victoria's been doing some of the policy work, but it really is, I mean, probably a year or two out. I don't want to misspeak and get people excited about it too quickly, but it is definitely something that we realize there's a huge gap for that, and we're working on a solution as best we can. The caveat that it's very complex, and got to make sure that, you know, everything is done right so that people can trust it.
Great, thanks. And this, we'll give this the place of honor as the last question. We often make the statement that well-curated, i.e. fairer data gets used and cited more frequently. I think we all believe this to be true, but I'm curious if you have any metrics that support this or thoughts about how this could be assessed over time within FRDR. And if the answer is not yet, that's fine.
I just want to clarify, because someone else asked about it as well. On my slide, it said that there's up to a 25% citation advantage with shared data. That's referring to data shared with an article, not necessarily curated. As I've been researching this, because I am also trying to always make a value case for curation and would love that. I haven't been able to find anything much more than anecdotal so far, but I think it's still an emerging field. So it's still in the process, and it's hard data to gather, ironically.
But now that we have FRDR, maybe we can find a way to make that kind of research happen. Just throwing it out there, because we all need more stuff to do.
Yeah, it's hard sometimes to know, you know, it's getting easier. The more kids we have, the easier it gets to sort of link objects and see who's citing what and where. But I mean, I was working at another repository. I was not involved in the project, but it involved scraping databases and, you know, like using AI to read through and pull out anything that looked like a DOI, and then trying to look back to see whether it was actually a data set. It wasn't easy to find the citations, but it's getting better.
Great. Well, thanks so much to all of our curation team for this great session, and thanks to all of the folks involved with FRDR for the session this week and last week. I think everyone's really excited. We're really thrilled that it's out there, and really thrilled that it's going to be contributing to the Canadian research community over hopefully the next long number of years. And thanks to everyone who attended today. Thank you all very much for coming. A link was put into the chat a couple of minutes ago to the survey for this webinar. If you have some thoughts that you'd like to share with us, that would be great. We're always looking to improve what we're doing. We will have another webinar coming up in a couple of weeks' time on the Cortra Seal project that is coming up. We should be seeing an announcement for that very shortly. And in the meantime, stay sane, stay safe, and we will see you all next time. Take care till then.